Respect in positions of power is not just about formalities or etiquette, it's about the example leaders set, especially when under scrutiny. When Donald Trump looked across the chamber and dismissed Representative Jasmine Crockett with the words, "Sit down, girl," it wasn't just a rude remark. It was a moment that peeled back a layer of how deeply ingrained disrespect can be in the language of those accustomed to unchecked authority. The phrase carried weight not only because of who said it, but because of what it represented. Crockett, a black woman, a congresswoman, and a former public defender, sat at the intersection of identities that have often been dismissed or diminished. In public discourse, the casual use of girl in that setting wasn't simply offhanded, was layered with implications of gender and racial diminishment, echoing a long history where black women in particular have been denied the professional respect they've earned. In that moment, Trump wasn't just trying to shut down a line of questioning. He was trying to reassert dominance by belittling a colleague who dared to challenge him with facts. It's worth noting that this didn't happen in a vacuum. Political discourse in the U.S. has increasingly blurred the line between assertion and aggression, particularly when power dynamics are at play. Many political leaders pride themselves on being blunt or unscripted, but there's a difference between speaking plainly and weaponizing language to degrade others. What happened between Trump and Crockett crystallized that difference for millions of Americans watching, especially those who are tired of seeing elected officials treated with less respect because of their race or gender. And yet, in the face of that disrespect, Crockett didn't flinch. Her response wasn't reactive, it was intentional. She addressed the comment not by rising to the same level of disrespect, but by calmly and directly reaffirming her right to be in that room and speak with authority. In doing so, she reminded the country that power isn't proven by how loudly someone speaks, but by how they carry themselves when challenged. What made this moment resonate wasn't just the exchange itself, but the way it highlighted a deeper truth, that respect in public service must be foundational. It's not optional. When those in power use their platform to belittle others, especially colleagues, it doesn't just diminish that individual. It erodes the institutions they serve. When someone like Trump speaks in a way that would be considered unacceptable in any professional workplace, it forces people to reconsider what kind of leadership they're willing to tolerate. Respect in leadership isn't about being agreeable. It's about recognizing that authority comes with a responsibility to model the kind of conduct that others, especially the next generation, can look to with trust. The tone set at the top echoes downward, and when that tone is dismissive or mocking, it trickles into the public's view of how our leaders should behave. That's why Crockett's poised response was more than just personnel, it was a quiet stand for the kind of discourse many feel this country desperately needs. In congressional halls where policy is debated, tempers often flare, but decorum still matters. Not because of tradition for tradition's sake, but because the legitimacy of democracy depends on a baseline of mutual respect. When a sitting president or former president chooses to speak to an elected official as if they don't belong in the room, it sends a message to every American watching. And when that behavior goes unchecked, it risks normalizing a culture where disrespect is not only tolerated but rewarded. That's why this moment left an impression. It was about more than two individuals. It was about the expectations we set for leadership and what happens when those expectations are violated. Watching a representative stand her ground with measured words and unwavering composure in the face of condescension became a rare thing, a teaching moment in real time, one that asked every viewer, regardless of political leaning, to consider the kind of behavior we demand from those who hold power, and what it means when they fall short. There's a misconception in American politics that the loudest voice in the room wins. Over the last decade, that idea has been reinforced by public figures who thrive on confrontation, soundbites, and social media moments designed to provoke rather than persuade. Donald Trump has long been a master of that style, using sharp jabs, dismissive language, and bravado to dominate the room. It's a method that has proven effective in gaining attention, but it's also reshaped the expectations around how leaders communicate, often at the cost of civility and substance. So when Trump told Representative Jasmine Crockett, "Sit down, girl," many expected a fiery clash. The stage was set for it, a high-profile hearing, cameras rolling, and an audience primed for conflict. But instead of meeting fire with fire, Crockett chose something entirely different. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult him back. She didn't lean on theatrics to make her point. She simply responded with composure and clarity, using calm as her weapon of choice. And it worked. In fact, it worked better than any shouted rebuttal could have, because while Trump's comment grabbed attention for its abrasiveness, Crockett's response captured something far more powerful, the ability to stay grounded in the face of disrespect. That restraint, that steadiness, it carried weight. It cut through the noise, not because it was dramatic, but because it was controlled. In politics, especially in today's media environment, calm is often underrated. There's an assumption that if you're not visibly angry or confrontational, you're not fighting hard enough. But Crockett proved otherwise. Her reply didn't lack passion, it had purpose. And that purpose was sharpened, not softened, by her decision to keep her voice steady. Instead of matching Trump's dismissiveness, she spoke like someone who knew she didn't need to prove herself to anyone in that room. Her credentials, her presence, and her words spoke for themselves. Asterisk, what made the moment so effective was the contrast. Trump's remark felt like a throwback, an outdated power move built on interruption and superiority. Crockett's answer, on the other hand, felt like a vision of where political discourse could go, assertive without being aggressive, confident without being combative. In that silence between her words, you could feel the shift, not because she had delivered a viral zinger, but because she had shown that dignity doesn't have to shout to be heard. Asterisk, there's also a deeper reason why her calm response resonated so widely. For many Americans, especially women, and particularly women of color, being told to calm down or sit down is a familiar experience. It's a tactic often used to undermine their authority or question their legitimacy. When Trump used those exact words, it wasn't just disrespectfully tapped into a broader cultural pattern that Crockett and many others have had to navigate their entire lives. So when she refused to take the bait, when she responded with calm conviction instead of outrage, she turned the tables on that pattern. She exposed the weakness in the insult by showing just how little it affected her. Asterisk. Trump's approach has always been about control, dominate the conversation, disarm the opponent, push them off balance. But this time, it didn't land. Crockett's refusal to escalate robbed the moment of the drama he thrives on. She didn't give him a headline, she gave him a lesson. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that strength doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes, it's the person who stays seated, speaks plainly, and refuses to be rattled who commands the most attention. Asterisk. Tom is not silence, it's not submission, it's strategic. Crockett knew the cameras were rolling. She knew the clip would circulate, and instead of feeding into the narrative of division, she offered something more controlled, more mature, and ultimately more effective. It didn't just make her look composed, it made Trump's remark look small. That's the power of calm. It reframes the moment, exposes the shallowness of insults, and gives viewers something far more powerful than a viral comeback. A real example of leadership under pressure. Asterisk. Words are never just words in politics. They are reflections of values, signals of intention, and mirrors of worldview. When Donald Trump responded to Representative Jasmine Crockett's line of questioning by saying, "Sit down, girl," it wasn't just an offhand comment, it was a statement that revealed a mindset. Whether he realized the full weight of the phrase or not, what he communicated in that moment went far beyond impatience. It revealed something deeper about how he perceives authority, respect, and who deserves to be taken seriously in a room full of power. Asterisk. In that split second, the choice of words said more than any policy talking point could. Girlless is a word that, in many contexts, is used to diminish, to infantilize, or to undercut a woman's authority. When directed at a sitting member of Congress, a black woman, who earned her seat through hard work, legal acumen, and public trust, that lands differently. It doesn't just miss the mark, it erases it. It reduces someone who is there to do her job into a stereotype that has long been used to deny black women the respect they deserve. Asterisk. This wasn't the first time Trump used dismissive language to try to dominate a conversation. Over the years, his public persona has been built on quick put-downs and deliberately provocative phrasing, often aimed at women or minorities who challenge him. He's labeled journalists nasty, insulted political opponents with nicknames, and downplayed legitimate questions as dumb or unimportant. His supporters often defend this as candor, but there's a difference between being direct and being deliberately demeaning. Asterisk. Jasmine Crockett's question to Trump was grounded in policy and accountability. She asked for clarification about economic outcomes in marginalized communities under his administration. She didn't interrupt, she didn't attack, she simply asked for clarity. But instead of engaging with the question, Trump used a term that immediately took the conversation out of the realm of ideas and into the territory of personal diminishment. Asterisk. That shift matters, because in politics, language isn't just about communication, it's about framing reality. When Trump used the word girl, he reframed Crockett's role in the room, not as a peer, not as a fellow leader, but as someone to be scolded or dismissed. And in doing so, he unintentionally exposed something many already suspect about him, that for all his claims to be a fighter for the people, his respect often seems conditional, granted to those who agree with him, and withheld from those who don't. Asterisk. Crockett's response highlighted that contrast perfectly. She didn't try to match him word for word. Instead, she pointed out the disrespect and reasserted her right to be heard without giving in to the insult. Her words, met and thoughtful, stood in stark contrast to the flippant tone of his, and because of that, her response carried more weight. It demonstrated that while he may have tried to diminish her with a word, she wasn't defined by it. Asterisk. What America saw in that moment was a clash of values. On one side, a former president using language that reduced a woman's authority to a stereotype. On the other, a congresswoman who responded with clarity, composure, and a demand for the respect her position and her constituents. That divide in how words were used revealed the deeper difference in how each person views power and respect. Asterisk. It also sparked broader conversations across social media and news outlets. Why is it that women, especially women of color, are still fighting to be treated as equals in spaces where they have already earned their seats? Why do some public figures continue to use language that echoes outdated, even harmful, cultural tropes? These questions didn't emerge from a policy debate, were prompted by a single word. A word that, in context, told Americans more about Trump's values than any prepared speech could. Asterisk. Language shapes the culture of our institutions. When public figures speak carelessly or disrespectfully, they don't just hurt the target of their words, they send a message to everyone watching about what is acceptable and what is not. Crockett's refusal to internalize that message and her insistence on redirecting the focus to the work she came to do served as a powerful reminder that leadership isn't just about holding a title, it's about the way you use your voice, and how you treat those around you, even when the cameras are on. Asterisk. Sometimes, leadership is defined not by sweeping legislation or landmark speeches, but by a single moment that reveals who a person truly is. When Donald Trump looked at Representative Jasmine Crockett and said, "Sit down, girl," the moment may have seemed small, just one line, tossed out in irritation, but its impact rippled far beyond that room. What followed was a moment that didn't just speak to character, but clarified the contrast between two very different approaches to power. Asterisk. Crockett, an attorney and freshman congresswoman from Texas, didn't just react, she responded. She didn't flinch. She didn't rise out of her seat in protest. She didn't even raise her voice. What she did was claim her space with a quiet authority that made everyone take notice. It was a moment that stripped away the noise and spectacle that so often dominates modern politics and replaced it with something rare. Grace under pressure. Asterisk. Trump's use of the phrase "sit down, girl" wasn't just a personal jab. It was an assertion of dominance, meant to put someone in their place. It came from a man who has long wielded bravado as a political weapon, relying on interruptions, insults, and performance to control the narrative. That strategy has worked for him many times before, derailing debates, throwing opponents off balance, and keeping the spotlight exactly where he wants it. But this time, the tactic didn't land. Crockett didn't bite. She didn't respond with fury, which is what would have made the clip go viral in his favor. Instead, she stayed seated and chose her words with precision and purpose. Asterisk. In doing so, she flipped the entire dynamic of the exchange. She didn't match disrespect with disrespect, she elevated the conversation. Her poise didn't just reflect on her own character, it put a spotlight on his. Suddenly, the man who had once mastered the art of spectacle looked small, and the woman he tried to dismiss stood taller than ever, without even standing up. That kind of composure doesn't just happen. It comes from confidence not just in oneself, but in the importance of the role you've been given and the people you represent. Asterisk. What made the moment resonate so powerfully was its authenticity. Crockett wasn't performing for the cameras. She was doing her job, asking pointed questions, seeking answers, and defending the dignity of her position. The fact that she did so with such clarity after being spoken to in such a dismissive way gave viewers a clear picture of who was behaving like a leader and who wasn't. Asterisk. In politics, reputations are built over years but can be defined in seconds. Those few seconds in that hearing room offered Americans something real. It showed that when tested, Crockett didn't lean on theatrics, and she didn't turn away. She stood her ground with words that carried more power precisely because they weren't shouted, and in doing so she demonstrated a different kind of leadership, one that values presence over performance, principles over provocation. Asterisk. For Trump, that moment revealed the limits of his usual approach. His words, which once might have dominated headlines for their shock value, felt tired, even predictable. The world has changed, and the public is more attuned than ever to how leaders treat one another, especially when those interactions are loaded with racial and gender undertones. In this case, Crocketts.com response wasn't just a personal victory, it was a cultural one. It sent a message to every person watching, especially young women and people of color, that you can be challenged, disrespected, even undermined, and still rise by staying centered. Asterisk. In an era where outrage often drowns out substance, Crockett offered something refreshing. Her words were sharp, but not cruel. Her tone was direct, but not hostile, and her message was unmistakable. She belongs in the room, and no one, not even a former president, gets to question that with a throwaway comment meant to diminish her. Asterisk. Leadership is tested in the unexpected. Anyone can prepare a speech or deliver a talking point, but when the moment turns and someone tries to take your dignity with a word, how you respond reveals who you really are. Crockett passed that test with quiet conviction, and in doing so, she showed millions of Americans what true leadership can look like, not in grand gestures, but in the stillness of a moment when everything could have come undone and didn't. Asterisk. What unfolded between Donald Trump and Representative Jasmine Crockett was more than just a viral headline or a moment of political theater, was a defining exchange that spoke volumes about leadership, identity, and the evolving expectations of public conduct. In the span of a few seconds, two vastly different approaches to power came into stark contrast. On one side stood a former president whose style has long been rooted in dominance and provocation. On the other, a freshman congresswoman who chose composure and principle over spectacle. And in that quiet, deliberate decision not to respond with anger, Crockett spoke louder than any insult ever could. Trump's comment, "Sit down," may have been said in frustration or even as a calculated jab, but its impact reached far deeper. It was a moment that exposed a lingering issue in American politics. The use of dismissive, condescending language to silence voices that challenge traditional hierarchies. For women, especially women of color, the road to power has always involved navigating these types of interactions, comments laced with disrespect, microaggressions disguised as jokes, and subtle or not so subtle efforts to undermine their legitimacy. Crockett didn't just push back against Trump's words. She stood up metaphorically for everyone who's been told they don't belong in the room they've earned a place in. What made her response resonate so widely was not just what she said, but how she said it. She didn't yell. She didn't grandstand. She didn't meet insult with insult. Instead, she used the moment to reaffirm her dignity and remind the nation that strength isn't measured by volume, it's measured by control, clarity, and confidence. Her calm in the face of disrespect gave the public a striking image of grace under pressure, and in that image, people saw more than just a politician, they saw a leader. In contrast, Trump's words, stripped of the bravado that once energized supporters, came across as dated and needlessly antagonistic. They reminded many of the very behavior they hoped leaders would move away from, language that divides, undermines, and belittles rather than uplifts or engages. In an age where voters are increasingly looking for leaders who model decency as well as decisiveness, moments like these become symbolic. They force the public to ask, who do we want representing us? Who do we trust to lead with both strength and respect? The encounter between Crockett and Trump was brief, but the lessons linger. It reminded Americans that even in the halls of Congress, where tensions run high and egos run deep, the power of a calm, firm, and principled voice can cut through the noise. Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond to a slight, she reframed the conversation entirely. And in doing so, she reminded the country that true leadership isn't about shouting the loudest. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to sit still, speak clearly, and let the world watch you.